Hey, good people. Welcome in. Dr. Lund here. Well, things continue to move forward with issues regarding the Idaho 4 students that were murdered, with an arrest, an affidavit, and looking at possibly a hearing set for late June or July of this year. Since the affidavit has come out and become public, there is a lot of questions about different issues related to some of the evidence that was laid out in the affidavit, and one of those issues seems to be concerned around the survivor who actually saw the murderer and could describe his weight, his build, that he had a mask on, and then she had locked herself into the bedroom, and as far as we know, 911 was not called until 7 or 8 hours later. At this time, we don't know if the second roommate, who was left unharmed, saw or heard anything, since her information was not included in the affidavit. So assuming she is the sole surviving witness of this horrible crime, I want to tell you a story about another sole surviving witness to a horrible crime that's related to Richard Speck, who raped, tortured, and murdered 8 student nurses on the night of July 13th, 1966, in their townhouse in Chicago, Illinois. Take a listen.
The murders shocked and horrified the entire city, resulting in one of the largest manhunts in the city of Chicago.
89 WLS plays more.
Richard Speck is sought tonight for the murder of those 8 student nurses in Chicago. Reports of his whereabouts have cropped up all the way from Illinois to Texas, where he's known to have relatives. Speck looks like the man. He fits the description given police by a lone survivor, and his fingerprints have been found in the apartment where the girls were killed.
I actually remember when this crime took place. I was about 9 or 10 years old, and we lived outside of Chicago, my parents and my older sister. And of course, being that young, I didn't really comprehend the significance of the crime, the details of the crime. But what I did comprehend was that there was a change in almost atmospheric pressure in my home. My family did not look comfortable in our own home. During the daytime, our doors were now locked, which back in the 60s, you didn't really do during the daytime. We weren't allowed to go outside by ourselves. And of course, at that time, it was such an inconvenience. But I remember my family being glued to the TV, looking at details about what was happening with this particular case, and had they caught the guy yet. So who was this guy that was changing the habits of not only my family's household, but a household far-reaching outside of the suburbs of Chicago? Richard Benjamin Speck was born in 1941 in a small city called Monmouth, Illinois, to 2 very religious parents. However, in 1947, his father, who was 53 years old at the time, who he was very close to, died from a heart attack. His mother remarried a few years later to a traveling salesman with a long criminal record who drank and was verbally abusive to Speck and his mother. This new family moved to East Dallas, Texas where they moved from house to house, living in many of the poor neighborhoods around the area. Speck was a poor student throughout school. He basically repeated the 8th grade and then dropped out his first semester of high school. As a young teenager, he had picked up his stepfather's drinking habits and was getting drunk almost every night. He had held a number of jobs, and he even gotten married after impregnating a 15-year-old girl he had met at a Texas state fair. However, he continued to run into trouble with the law. He had received a tattoo, "Born to Raise Hell," which would become significant in his identification, on his arm, and certainly lived by that ethic. He would be arrested at least 41 times before the age of 24. After the divorce from his wife, Speck then moved and stayed with one of his 2 sisters in Chicago, Illinois. By July of 1966, he was waiting to get a job on a ship with the National Maritime Union. However, when he believed he received that assignment, he went to find out that his position had been given to someone else and became enraged, and then embarked on a drinking spree in the neighborhood of South Chicago. After a day of drinking, Speck then took a woman who was 53 years old and had spent the day drinking with him to his room, held her by knife point, raped and robbed her. He then started down the streets of South Chicago and came across a townhouse that was functioning basically as a dormitory for 9 student nurses at the South Chicago Community Hospital. At 11 p.m. that night, Speck entered the townhouse through one of the windows, gathered all the student nurses together, tied them up with bedsheet strips, herded them into a large bedroom area, and then basically took them one by one, where he stabbed, strangled, raped, and murdered all except one of the student nurses who had hid underneath the bed. While Speck was murdering the nurses, he obviously had lost count of how many were in that particular room, and so he left one sole survivor. Here are the victims.
23-year-old Nina Schmale wanted to be a psychiatric nurse and was engaged to her boyfriend of 7 years. Marianne Jordan was an athletic 21-year-old who liked to play pranks and loved rock and roll. 20-year-old Patricia Matusek was a champion swimmer and was busy making wedding plans with her fiancé. Suzanne Ferris was 21 and planning a career in pediatric nursing. She too was looking forward to her upcoming wedding. Pamela Wilkening was known as Willie to her friends. She was 20 years old and once told a friend, "I want to be a nurse more than anything in the world." Valentina Pasion was an exchange nurse from the Philippines. She was 24 years old and had been in the United States for only 10 weeks. Another exchange nurse, Merlita Gargulo, was 23 and the eldest of 9 brothers and sisters. She was homesick for her family in the Philippines. 22-year-old Gloria Davy enjoyed writing poetry and had recently celebrated her engagement. She was described as the class golden girl.
A description of the horrific crime scene is best done by one of the original detectives who worked the case.
Myself and my partner Byron Carlisle were the first 2 detectives on the scene.
Homicide detective Jack Walenda.
On the couch was a nude woman with her hands tied behind her back, As I walked up the stairs, at the top of the stairway was a body of a naked girl. When I turned to the right, to the front bedroom, there was 3 more bodies laying in that room, and all 3 girls had stab wounds and puncture wounds in the various parts of their body. When walking out of that bedroom into the front west bedroom, there was a body on the bed, and she had her throat cut. And then on the floor in that same bedroom were the 2 Filipino girls, and the other girl had her throat slashed where you could take the side of your hand and place it in the wound.
I counted 8 bodies. He said, yeah, there's 8 victims. He said, but there's 1 survivor next door. I said, survivor? Survivor?
Corazon Amurao, also an exchange nurse from the Philippines, lives through the massacre. She is 23 and has been in Chicago less than 3 months.
Yes, there was one sole survivor, Corazon Amurao. She had reported that none of her friends screamed as they were being led from the room, but later she had heard muffled cries and moans. When Speck had turned his back, she then had rolled under the bed in the room where they all had been originally sitting. This part of the story sounds eerily the same of what we know in the Idaho 4 murders, at least from the information in the affidavit. Corazon reported that she had stayed hidden under the bed until about 6 a.m. for safe measures, hours after Speck had finished his rampage. Again, very similar to at least what we know now about the sole survivor in the Idaho 4. And that may answer questions or be part of why 911 was not called immediately. Corazon reported while she was hiding under the bed, she had no idea that her friends were being murdered until she left the safety of that hiding space and ran to a window, pulled out the screen, and started screaming, "They were all dead. They're all dead. I'm the only one alive." Only days after the murders, Speck found out from the newspapers that there was a sole surviving witness. At that point in time, in a drunken stupor, he had gone to a flop house and tried to commit suicide, but was taken to a hospital where one of the doctors in the emergency room had recognized the tattoo that he had seen in the paper of the murderer. In addition, they had sent Corazon in, acting as an assistant nurse, to identify if that was the man that she had seen during the rampage. Corazon had come out of Speck's room and had reported, yes, he in fact was the man, and then promptly fainted. Corazon was kept under lock and key and protected by 4 detectives until the time of Speck's trial, where she again stood up in court, walked in front of him, pointed to him, and stated, yes, this is the man, and identified him, for which he was then very quickly found guilty of murder and was sentenced to death. However, in a ruling from the Supreme Court in 1971, the death sentence was found unconstitutional, and so Speck's sentence was then converted to life in prison. Richard Speck died in prison on December 5th, 1991, on the eve of his 50th birthday from a heart attack. However, Corazon, she went on to become a nurse and have a family. Corazon never gave an interview, never talked about this experience until after Speck's death, because she stated that she was fearful, and even when she got the news that he had died, she still wasn't quite sure that he was actually dead. So that fear really stayed with her for her entire life. In April of 1993, Corazon did do an interview with Oprah Winfrey. And she was asked questions such as, well, with 8 of you there, did you not think about trying to stop him from doing anything? Sort of like the question, there were more of you than there were of him. And interestingly, Corazon had talked about the fact that they believed that he was there just for money, as he had said. He was trying to get to New Orleans and had them each take money from their purses to be able to help him get to where he needed to be. And that he sat and talked with them, smiled, laughed, had conversations. And so she believed, as well as apparently the other women believed, that he had no plans to hurt them. While watching Corazon during the interview with Oprah, it really became apparent that the things I've been taught and many first responders have been taught is when you are dealing with somebody who has been in a life or death crisis moment, many times they are very easily led. In fact, that's the time when you give someone direction, because they are so emotionally overwhelmed that they can't make decisions. They don't know what to do. They can't even think of options of what decisions to make. So it doesn't seem out of the ordinary that when these women were in a crisis situation, even trying to believe that this man was not going to hurt them, they weren't screaming, they weren't plotting to overtake him. They were trying to keep him calm, thinking if they were compliant, that he would get the money and he would leave them unharmed. That's not uncommon. You see these kind of reactions of people freezing in certain situations they have no control over. When you're going to think an airplane is going to crash. When you have a shooter in the area. When you have no control and somebody else is dictating what you will do and when you'll do it, being compliant for many victims is basically second nature. In her interview, Corazon talked about being under the bed since Speck had basically entered the townhouse about 11 p.m. and then systematically started taking one woman at a time to different rooms as he brutally murdered them. She was able to loosen the ties of her hands. However, she stated that she had stayed in her hiding place for approximately 6 hours And then when she heard an alarm go off, like an alarm to wake the girls up for their shifts or for classes, that's when she decided she would leave her hiding place, hoping that the assailant was gone, and ran to the window, took out a screen, and started screaming for help. So when you look at that situation of how she protected herself, she stayed in the same place, and you compare that to at least what we know, which is certainly not everything, in the Idaho 4 murder cases, that the roommate didn't call 911 until 8 hours later. When you're looking at the comparison, it's not that different. Corazon didn't realize that her roommates had been all murdered until she left that bedroom. And the one sole witness of the 2 surviving roommates in the Idaho 4 case may not have known, if she had locked herself in the bedroom, that her roommates had been murdered. So I see a lot of similarities in some of the self-preservation behaviors, in the silent compliance behaviors, which I don't find unusual. And actually, probably in both cases, their lives were saved because of what they did or didn't do. The men you see with Corazon are the men who protected her during the time between the crime and the time when Speck was put on trial. In the interview with Oprah, Corazon had not seen these men for 26 years.
There were 5 Chicago police officers who went really above and beyond the call of duty when they were assigned to watch over Cora after these murders. They took her for rides and took her shopping and even taught her to play poker. As I understand it, it was because of you that Richard Speck ended up in the hospital, because he tried to kill himself after realizing that he had left a survivor. So were you under special police protection then?
Yeah, I was, yeah.
You were. Please welcome Jack Walinda, Jim Concannon, Ronaldo Cozy, and Jim Georgialis. Thank you very much. Jim Georgialis. And Stephen McCarthy. Give me a little help up here. Come right on up. Right on up.
Corazon, Jim, sure, jealous. Good to see you.
Yeah, I still remember you all.
You still play poker? Play a little ping pong.
I still remember you all. I don't forget you.
Sure.
Yeah.
This is a gut-wrenching video of a 26-year reunion where 5 police officers and this young woman are the only ones on the planet who had experienced firsthand the slaughter of these young nurses during the prime of their life. It was extremely moving, and one of the few times Corazon showed any emotion during this interview.
Cora and my next guest also haven't seen each other in 26 years. William Martin was Cora's attorney and became known as the man who put Richard Speck behind bars. He's co-written a book about his experience called Crime of the Century. Mr. Martin, would you come on out? Perhaps, William, you can give us some kind of insight into why. I mean, the big question, I know, and even in the book, is about why the nurses didn't fight.
The situation that they were confronted with involved an intruder with a gun and a knife. An intruder who was practiced at putting people at ease with a smile and a relaxed manner, saying, I just want money to go to New Orleans. And a man who didn't give any evidence of intending violence. The girls were in a physical location in which, being in the end townhouse, and on all four sides, they had no opportunity whatsoever, if they had screamed, to get help. There was a park behind them, a school across the street. The one common wall, and as fate had it, the next door neighbors were on vacation, which the girls knew. And the other wall was solid brick. So they were, even though in a residential neighborhood, they were really an island with no opportunity.
So, folks, here are some of my takeaways of the blessing and the curse of being the sole surviving witness. The blessing of surviving such a horrendous crime is somewhat obvious. You have a life, you have a future, you can make decisions of how you use the experience, how it either holds you back or pushes you forward. The curse of being a sole surviving witness seems like it hadn't changed much since 1966. And in looking at the crime of the Idaho 4, part of the curse is living with PTSD, which actually in 1966 wasn't a diagnosis. That didn't happen until 1980, when it was listed in the DSM manual, the 3rd edition. And some of those symptoms include the fear, guilt, anxiety, nightmares. Having a smell or a sound or a sight puts you right back in that situation, something we call an abreaction. Spending a lifetime second-guessing your actions or your inactions, or at times feeling the anger of family members of other victims, wondering why you lived and their family member didn't. Going through a court case, having to talk about what you saw, and having an attorney trying to discredit or invalidate the experience that you went through. And in my opinion, it's so disheartening to see the same critical judgment of people who have no experience, have never been in this horrific situation. Question, why didn't you do something different? Why didn't you alert someone sooner? Why didn't you overpower the attacker? And lay blame at the feet of the sole surviving witnesses rather than at the attacker, where it should be placed. Let's hope we do better with these sole surviving witnesses rather than adding to their trauma and re-traumatizing them for the rest of their life. I thank you all for listening. Like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.